these 2014 elections for the European Parliament are a challenge, and there are various ways of approaching it. We could, as a party, say, it's going to be expensive fighting this campaign, we're going to use up a lot of resources, a lot of energy. Why don't we just sit it out, do the minimal amount of work, let the Tory UKIP slugfest continue, and we'll keep our powder dry until 2015. I categorically reject that approach of us sitting back and waiting out that election. If we don't find the right tone of a positive, critical reform agenda for Europe in 2014, we will allow the debate on Europe and our European future to be dominated by the right, remembering that that debate is simply the prelude to an all-out onslaught on the welfare state. Secondly, we will not provide for our party the springboard that it requires, the successful springboard that it requires for the 2015 general election. We need Labour to come out on top in 2014. We need all our present Labour MEPs returned in 2014, and we need Richard to be elected again, we need Glyn to be elected again, and many of the other candidates in this room to be elected again, and that will only come about by the efforts of everybody here and everybody in the party. The second temptation that must be avoided is to say this referendum, or this election, is simply a referendum on the Cameron coalition government. And we won't talk about Europe, we'll talk about national issues. That fails the relevancy test. It fails the British people because it doesn't tell them what's really at stake in the European election. And if our party gives the impression that there aren't strong European issues at stake in the European elections, that's a sign really that the elections don't matter that much. And therefore it is absolutely indispensable, in my view, that we talk about Europe in that campaign. But not a question of we defend Europe right or wrong. We make that campaign an occasion for an onslaught on the right's record in management in Europe. Because, friends, the last 10 years have seen a growing, creeping domination of the right in all the European institutions. A majority of member states with right-wing governments. A majority in the European Parliament on the right and centre-right. And Catherine was saying to me earlier how difficult it was with their current numbers for socialists to win the votes. And of course, a strong right-wing majority in the Commission, led by a right-wing president, with right-wingers in most of the key positions, including international trade, where the objective appears to be cut the deal on trade, irrespective of human rights, irrespective of international labour standards, etc. Should we allow that crew, the Barroso crew, to remain in office for another 5 years after that 5 years record of failure?
No.
Failure. You're getting it. Failure to provide the right regulatory structure to ensure that economic and financial activity comes under proper scrutiny and control. Failure to combat the growth of poverty widespread throughout Europe. Failure to attack the scandal of growing youth unemployment. Failure to resist the return in force of the old inequalities. Because that is the record of Europe, not as a question of accidental consequences of the current economic and financial crisis, but as a deliberate element of policy. The policy of the European Commission, which seems determined at some times to make the IMF appear like some benevolent society approach, is squeeze public spending in member states. When a member state is cutting expenditure so much that its health service is put in danger, its education system is undermined, squeeze it further, and that quite frankly is something which is quite unacceptable and economically illiterate, because in the end it causes that member state to have even more difficulty in fighting the problem of unemployment. We have to say This Europe is not the Europe that we want. This Europe is responsible for many of the economic woes that are being felt. This Europe is the one which is creating such anger in many of the member states that there is a strong populist reaction against Europe and against the political system, a populist reaction which in most member states is, if you like, the opening salvo for the extreme right. All of that requires change, and the starting point for the change is obviously changing governments in member states. We hope for a change tonight in Berlin. We hope for changes in other member states, but the key and the immediate objective for us in Britain must be the 2014 elections. Make the socialist group again the largest political group in the European Parliament. With a strong Labour contingent in that group, actively involved in the development of socialist policies and fighting the election on a European socialist platform. And in that way, the anger that is out there, we can canalise it in a positive direction. There are huge matters at stake in the next 5 years. The whole of our trading relationships with the United States, with China, with Japan, with Singapore and the rest are up for grabs now and in the next 5 years. Whether or not we continue with an attempt to try to supervise the banks which got us into the difficulty in the first place, whether we give adequate funding to combat youth unemployment, what sort of budget? Is it a budget going to be directed towards competitiveness or a budget towards which simply props up existing policies which benefit only small parts of society? Those are the issues which are really at stake. We must talk about those issues, but not simply talk about it and say Europe's got it wrong. Talk about it and say Europe can get it right if there is a proper socialist platform which we put forward, and then we fight for it. And we fight for it as if we care, and we fight for it to win. Thank you.